Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here and being on time. It's very important to be on time for these sessions, especially in the morning, and when it's really cold, it's hard. Again, I'm Olga Shurchkov. I'm the faculty director of Albright, and welcome, everybody. I saw you this morning on Zoom, and it's so much nicer to see you in person here today. Today we have our next keynote speaker, Professor Joyce, Professor Joyce, my colleague in the economics department, but importantly the founding director of the Albright Institute. Mercy will tell you more about his distinguished career, but I wanted to just jump in and say that Professor Joyce was my professor in economics at Wellesley. Yes, I mean, I'm dating myself also a lot, so I'm kind of dating, and I know that in Professor Joyce's classes, you gotta get on those questions and comments really quickly when he is ready to take questions from the group, because guess what? He cold calls. And so for my students here in the audience who have taken economics with me, you know that I sometimes cold call a little bit too, and that is Professor Joyce's legacy with me. So without further ado, I will pass on the mic to Mercy, who will introduce Professor Joyce further.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. As Olga said, my name is Mercy, and it is truly my honor to introduce our speaker for today's session. It is a pleasure to present somebody that I truly deeply admire, Professor Joyce. He was born in New York, and he went on to study international relations and affairs at Georgetown University before earning his doctorate degree in economics from Boston University. Beyond his academic accomplishments, he's a devoted father to 2 daughters and a husband of 35 years, an anniversary that he and his wife are celebrating this month. Professor Joyce has been teaching at Wellesley for 45 years, and he still walks into every room and every classroom with genuine enthusiasm. He loves engaging with smart, curious women and guiding them through economic issues that shape the world around us. His research focuses on international macroeconomics, particularly capital flows between nations, which is a topic that he will be sharing with us today. He was also the founding director of the Albright Institute, serving for 7 years between 2010 and 2016. I've also had the greatest privilege of knowing him for the past 4 years, and I can confidently say that he is exceptional at what he does, which, well, I would know because I borrow at least 4 books a month on his behalf as my duties as student assistant in the economics department, which, well, you would think I'll be the one borrowing those books, but, well, I am not the one, so, yeah. I hope you enjoyed the session today of Capital Flows Between Nations, and please join me in welcoming Professor Joyce. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm going to cry. I'm so happy to be here. I stood in the library lecture room 17 years ago to a group of 40 young women just like you, who knew all my fellows, didn't know what they were in for, but they were up for it. I'm sorry, fellow. And so we started in January 2010, and it was all new. And we had it planned, but we didn't know how it would go. And we had a very, very good first month. And as you well know, it continued. And 17 years later, here we are. Olga, who I did indeed know as a student, is the faculty director. I've got to know Katie a little bit, so I can tell you you're in very good hands. I want to talk to you this morning about a topic you probably have come across in the paper and elsewhere called fragmentation. And we're going to do some definitions in a minute. But basically, we're trying to look at what's going on in terms of not just economics, but politics as well. And at some point, we're going to stop. And I'm going to have you do a little discussion with each other and come back to talk about some of the issues we've been talking about, because it transcends what I'm doing. And in 3 weeks, we'll have our distinguished visiting professor who'll be talking about migration. And you'll see ties between what I'm doing right now and what she's doing then. So hopefully, you'll be able to kind of keep some of these things in mind as we talk. Ready? Let's do some definitions. So what exactly is globalization? It basically is the linkages of different markets, where the markets could be for goods and services, things that you and I buy, could be the markets for labor, and that's migration, or it could be the markets where people lend and borrow money, and those are the financial markets. Over time, those markets have become more and more integrated, which means that you can buy things around the world usually, sell things, you can invest abroad, and you might be able to take a job in a foreign country. That's all globalization, okay? However, these days, that ability is being hindered by a lot of different things, particularly government policies. That's fragmentation. So globalization, or when the linkages are made together, fragmentation is breaking them up. And you and I are going to talk about why that's happening. There are all sorts of implications which are political, which are social, which are historic. I'm not any of those. I'm an economist. So you're going to get the economist view of things. I realize I'm going to simplify a lot, and some of you are going to pick up on that. So bear with me. We only have 75 minutes. I can't do everything. But I am going to tell you a story. And it's a story which I think you'll find interesting and which will resonate with you. Okay? So last thing, if I speak too fast, tell me. That's because I grew up in New York City. If I use jargon, stop me if you don't recognize it. There's no point in my talking if you don't quite know what I'm referring to. But I think I'll be able to hit the right place for that. Okay? All right. Fast history lesson. First era of globalization took place starting around 1870, went up to 1914. Why 1870? There was a lot going on in the 19th century, particularly in transport and communication. In transport, we had steam power. Steam power made railroads go. Steam power made ships go. And so as a result, travel by people and delivery of goods became a lot faster, cheaper, easier to do. You could span the United States in, I don't know exactly how much time, but I'm guessing a week, as opposed to a covered wagon over months and months. You could cross the Atlantic Ocean, not in months, but in 10 days. All those things obviously speeded things up and made things easier to do. Communications became easier. We went from the Pony Express, for example, here in the US, to telegraphs, to telephones, to overseas cable lines. So it became easier to talk to people on the other side of the globe. So right away, you can see, yeah, that's going to speed things up. So we have those innovations going on at this time. We have something called the gold standard, which simply means that the amount of money in any one country was tied to a certain amount of gold, which meant that you as an investor could invest your money overseas. Now, whether or not the investment was successful depended, but at least you knew when you brought money back home how much you'd have in your pocket in the domestic currency when it came back, because it was guaranteed in terms of gold. So that made it easier, or if you like, easier and less risky for investors to put their money around the world. Okay? So we have these great technological changes. We have the gold standard. We have one what's called hegemonic nation, and that's Great Britain. And they are enforcing peace when they want to. So it's a very much careful when you think about that, what that means. And of course, we had colonization. And colonization was a huge part of this era. Colonization in particular of Africa and some parts of Asia. And so we had colonial powers like Britain and France and all these other what would become countries, although at the time they were colonies. All these things are happening around the same time, and it leads to a burst of innovation and travel. World exports rise, they double as a percent of GDP from 48%. World GDP per capita, which is income per person, is rising by over 1% a year, which is much faster than anything which had been seen before in history. The world economy is bound together as never before. And so the benefits are there. They're not shared equally, as we're about to see, but there are benefits, okay? And then it comes to an end. So before we come to the end, let me show you what I mean by not shared equally. This is a graph that shows income per person, GDP per capita, going from 1820 on the left up to 1910 on the right. And I hope you can see the colors well. Top line are what's called the Western offshoots. That would be the US, Canada, Australia. And you can see they benefited a lot over this period because they were attracting so much capital, so much labor, they had natural resources, and they were ready for growth. The next line down are where that money and people came from, which would be Western Europe. So again, we're talking mostly here of Britain and France, but Western Europe overall. And then below, you basically see everybody else. The rest of Europe, obviously Asia, Africa, places like that. So that's what I mean by the benefits were not shared equally. Okay? That's going to be important to watch. So as I just said, all this comes to an end in 1914. I won't ask you what happened in 1914. You all know. World War I breaks out. And obviously the travel, the cable, all the things that I've just mentioned to you come to a stop. And now for 4 years, we have warfare. Finally ends in 1918. Governments would have liked to go back to this period, but it was hard. So much had changed as a result of the war, you couldn't go back to the same policies. So the 1920s were kind of a rocky period. 1930s, as I hope you know, is a Great Depression, a worldwide fall in income. Everybody is feeling the impact. And it ends with this outburst of World War II. So basically, you have to think about it, 30 years between 1914 and 1944 of enormous chaos and enormous disruption, and obviously a lot of suffering in the world. Okay? So that's the first era of modern globalization. Along comes the second. Now, this begins in 1945 at the end of World War II, and it's guided by some principles adopted at a conference of the Allied nations, the ones that won the war, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. So it's called the Bretton Woods regime. So very quickly, why Bretton Woods? Why are they at a ski resort? I'll tell you the story real fast. Because the representatives of the 44 countries were meeting here in the US, and they were down in Washington. Anyone who's been in Washington, D.C. in the summer knows where this is going. That it gets very, very hot, humid, and sticky, and there's no air conditioning in 1944. So comes the summer, they open up the ski resort in New Hampshire, they load the delegates on trains, come up the East Coast, I assume up to Boston. How they got to New Hampshire from there, I'm not quite sure, but they found a way, and that's why it's Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Okay. What did they decide on? First thing, they were not going back to the 1930s. No way. That world was gone. They didn't want to have any repeat of it. So what can they do to avoid it? Well, this time they're going to manage globalization better than they did back in the previous periods. And that includes a couple of things. It includes having a new hegemonic nation. Of course, that's the United States. They're taking the place of Britain by this period. Okay? We have controls on capital flows, and capital includes finance, financial flows, because they thought they had been too disruptive beforehand. And they allowed central banks to have more control of monetary policy than they did under the gold standard. So can you see why governments now are becoming more active? They don't want the Great Depression. They'll do what they need to do to stop it. Okay? It's more than Bretton Woods. A lot of things are going on. By the way, all this history is great to learn. I enjoy talking about it, and if you want some references later, I'd be happy to give them to you. There's a reduction of trade barriers. We have migration coming back, but it never reaches the scale as a percent of the total world population that it did before 1914. So it's more limited. Governments aren't letting people in, but really limiting who they allow in. And again, that's new, isn't it, compared to the pre-World War I era. Okay? We have more advances in technology. We have jetliners, more advances in communication. We have satellites. So making an overseas call now is a lot easier and cheaper than it would have been over a cable line. And as a result, we enter a period that's known as the golden era of growth under Bretton Woods. World exports are rising quickly during this period. Again, per capita GDP by 3%, a lot more than 1.8%. So that's certainly an increase. But again, it's an advanced nation phenomenon. Benefits are going mostly on the European side. And the growth in what I call the developing economies is much slower. Okay? Bretton Woods ends in the 1970s when fixed exchange rates, which is what they had, broke down. Kind of a technical reason, don't need to worry about it, okay? But also because of stagflation. Stagflation is an ugly word for an ugly phenomenon. Rising prices and rising unemployment. And one of the reasons I want to make sure I mention it is that, I hate to tell you this, some people think we're about to enter another period of stagflation like now. So as you watch the headlines of future months, this word may come back to you, stagflation. But let me show you a map of the world that I grew up in. Anybody want to tell me exactly what those colors are and what they refer to? Anybody who took AP history in high school knows, or should know. Who wants to be first? Ria. She knows me, so she knows it's safe to answer me. Priya. Louder.
First world, second world, third world division.
Exactly. So let's explain what those are. First world would be the advanced nations, mostly, again, Western Europe, the US, Canada. Think about Japan, think about Australia. They did a lot of trade with each other, okay? And clearly the first world were the richer countries. Second world would be the Soviet Union, the Eastern European countries that it controlled, obviously China and North Korea. So those were the communist countries. They had central planning. They did some linkages with each other, not a lot, and certainly practically none with the first world. That leaves everybody else, the third world. And these are developing economies, many of which, as we go forward in history, were colonies. So these are places that had been colonies pre-1945 and now are achieving nationhoods, sometimes easily, sometimes not so easily. And again, there's a lot of great history to be learned there. These countries do indeed have economic relations with the first world, but it's a little uneven in that the third world has commodities, copper, tin, tea, coffee, go down the list, and they sell them to the first world countries in exchange for exports of manufactured goods. So manufactured goods are made in the US, Europe, Japan, sold to the countries in the third world in exchange for their commodities. And the problem is that the exchange isn't quite equal. For one thing, over time, the increase in commodities is positive, but not quite that fast, not as fast as their demand for manufacturers in their own countries. So it's a little tilted against the third world, isn't it? And I assure you they know that, okay? They try very hard to be non-aligned. They're not part of the first world. They're not part of the second world. They are who they are. And countries like India, Yugoslavia took leadership roles to make sure that they had that status, okay? So that's the world I grew up in. And that's like the end of the first part of what I want to talk about this morning. So let me stop for a minute to get my voice back and to allow you to ask any questions, if anything wasn't clear, if I can clarify anything or give you more information. So any questions? That world's gone. It's gone, okay? It's the world I grew up in, and starting in the 1990s, it began to disappear, okay? Why do I say that? Well, again, I bet most of you know at least some of the history. Certainly we have the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That means that the East European countries come out from behind what we call the Iron Curtain, and they very much want to catch up with their Western cousins in Britain and France and Spain and countries like that. At the same time, the two biggest countries in terms of population are changing. China is turning towards a market economy, which will include exports, a topic that goes through today, literally, okay, Chinese exports. India is opening its economy and having a lot of market reforms. So the world's two biggest economies are changing in terms of their policies. It's not just them. Many developing countries promote growth through exports. So they learn how to make the manufactured goods themselves, and they sell them. And a lot of countries latch onto this, including South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia. I ran out of space, so I couldn't write in Malaysia, but I think you get the point. A lot of Asian countries were there selling their goods. It wasn't just East Asia or South Asia, it was Latin America. So Brazil, Mexico become players in the global markets as well. We have something called the North American Free Trade Association, NAFTA, which is signed in 1994 and makes a big common trade area between Mexico, Canada, and the US, which means that goods can cross the borders without tariffs. And that leads to the development of industries that literally span those countries. There is no US auto industry. There's a North American auto industry with plants in Detroit and Windsor in Canada and places in Mexico. But it's not American, it really truly does transcend those borders. We have the World Trade Organization set up in 1995 to promote trade. So virtually all countries belong to it. China's going to join it, I think, in 2005, the early 2000s. And that's their job, to have more trade take place. And we have what's called a liberalization, or taking away, of controls on capital flows. Capital flows involve, obviously, the transmission of capital. And I will tell you that capital is a word that economists use a little loosely. And we use the word to refer to different things. So capital could include investment by multinational companies in other countries. It could include, however, the amount of stocks and bonds that you as an individual or a place like Fidelity or Vanguard buy for their clients. Or it could be a big bank like Chase that makes loans around the world. All those things are capital flows, and they are being deregulated during this period. So money is crossing across frontiers a lot more quickly. Partly as a result of that, things blow up, at least in terms of finance. So we have financial crises in East Asia in 97, 98, in Mexico in 95, Argentina, Turkey around 1999. So a lot of things are unstable, which probably means the money came too quickly before these countries were ready for it. So they learned a lesson and slowed things down after that. Among the countries that did not have a crisis were China and India. Why? Because they already control the amount of capital coming in. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay? So we have all that going on. And again, we have changes in information and communication technology, including the internet. And I know it's hard to believe there was a world without the internet. I'm here to tell you there was. And having it, though, available, particularly more and more easily, the advent of laptops, et cetera, means that communication gets really easy, which allows a multinational based in Tokyo, New York, Bonn, to be able to speak to their own units in East Asia, South America, East Europe, very easily. So you can easily run what's called a global supply chain between different units in different countries, and here's headquarters over here, and they're in constant touch. They're constantly communicating and adjusting things. So that's what a global supply chain is. And clearly it made delivery a lot faster and helped make things cheaper when they could be sourced out of countries that were low wages. Transportation. Today we take for granted the huge container ships that we see sometimes on TV. Well, they were getting bigger during this period. And again, that made shipping quicker and it made it cheaper. So we're having advances in that area as well. Okay? FDI is the type of capital that companies, which are multinationals, are doing. So FDI, again, is when a multinational in, maybe an advanced economy, is setting up plants in South America, Africa, Asia, a place like that. And that's increasing. Okay? Finally, we have kind of a change in migration. It's not so much the numbers as where the people come from and where they're going. They're coming more and more from the developing economies, the former third world, except they're not really a third world anymore, are they? They're now one part of a bigger world. And they're going to the countries which are doing well and have room for a bigger labor force, which would be Canada, the US, and the United Kingdom. So lots going on during this period, and that's why I say the 1990s is underappreciated in terms of what a transformation this was of the world that had been there previously. As a result, world economic growth goes up, particularly in the 1990s. Exports rise as a percent of world GDP to 19% by the year 2000. And as I hope you figured out, a lot of that growth is going on in emerging market nations. And we have the emergence of the BRICS, which, as I hope you know, is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And these are developing economies, emerging markets, which feel they have much more in common with each other than they would with the US, Japan, and Germany, which are in a different grouping altogether. The graph shows you the percent change in GDP during this period from 1990 to 2006. And if you can see the lines clearly, the blue line up at top is China. And for a while, their average growth was 14%. Guys, we had never seen this before. Literally, we had never seen growth that fast. India's behind them, but it's not doing too badly either, okay? And they're getting growth of over 7% for a while. So that's what I mean about the changes, because the rest of the world is lagging behind, particularly advanced economies. So things are switching over. Okay? Let me tell you a little bit about the capital flows, because I find this story and the next one really interesting. And I hope to do more work on it starting next year and write some things about it. So I enjoy having the chance to kind of present it to you. Capital flows. And again, we're talking about FDI, foreign direct investment. And I said they're flowing from the advanced economies, such as the US, to emerging markets such as India. Doesn't have to be the US. I could have written Germany there. I could have written Japan. Doesn't have to be India. I could have put down Poland or China or many of those countries. I'm simply using them so you can literally visualize what I'm talking about. And so multinationals are sending money to places like India to open up plants. That's the solid line with the arrow going to the right. And presumably they do this because they make money. And those profits go from India back to the owners of the corporation in the United States. So India is taking the FDI in. Why? Because the multinational firms do a lot of good things for a country. They hire people. They train people in technology they might not have in the country. They have people who help supply them within the country. You need local suppliers. They might use the local banks. That's nice for the banking network. And so the country is getting something out of it. India is benefiting. But of course, the firm does expect to make some money, and those are the profits which are going to flow from India, from the various countries we talked about, back to the parent companies in the advanced economies. Okay? So that's one interesting flow that's going on of capital. Okay? But it's not the only flow. How about labor? And so we have labor flowing also during this period, slowly increasing. Again, from a country such as India, could be another country, but India is a good example because India does have a lot of migrant workers, and people from South Asia know all about that. And they're going to places like Europe, the US, as well as the Gulf countries. Places like Saudi Arabia have a lot of immigrants from India, and they're working there. And they go there because they can do better than they could at home. They make more money. And some of the income they earn goes back to the home country, particularly to families. So you have a family, the oldest son or daughter, and these are women, by the way, might go to, for example, Britain. They're doing okay in Britain, they're making some money, and once a month they send money back home. That's good, as you can imagine. It helps the family lift themselves out of poverty a bit, helps them to educate their siblings. So I've read really interesting stories about Nigerian lawyers in Britain who send money back to Nigeria for their younger children. So you can see right away what's going on here. It's a family enterprise. It's not just one person going away. I'm going there, and I'm going to send money back home. And that remittances money coming into India or someplace like that. Okay? So let me stop to make sure you see this. Two types of flows, capital and labor. Those are called the factors of production, so there's your jargon for the day. So the factors of production include capital and labor. I could, on a tangent, talk about natural resources. Those are the things we usually take for granted, but much less so than we used to. So that's there as well. But I want to simplify it because I find the capital-labor division really interesting. Okay? Let me show you why. Put it together. You have these flows of the factors, and I hope I can convince you they're mirror images of each other. The advanced economies, the US, for example, is sending out FDI, making money, but they're accepting immigrants, and those immigrants send money back home. Flip it. Look at India. They're receiving the FDI. Companies are making money. Those are the profits that go back to them. But they also have people leaving, the workers, and the workers are leaving to work elsewhere, and they send money back home. So the two literally are mirror images of each other. Okay? To an economist, all this makes sense. Why? Because the capital is coming from what are called the capital-abundant countries, the countries that have a lot of capital already, and they're looking for the best return they can get, and many times the best return might be obviously in one of these developing or emerging market countries. At the same time, you have laborers in India and other places wanting to make more money. They know if they can get a job in Europe, the US, they may be able to do that. So they're going to places which don't have as much labor. And so do you see what's going on? Each factor is going to where it adds the highest return. And to an economist, That makes sense. That's called an efficient allocation of resources. And don't worry about the jargon. Just go with makes sense. That the factors are going to where they're going to do the best that they can. Okay? And that's a good thing. That's going to be my argument. You may disagree, which is your right. But let me give you a little more information. How does all this work out? Well, here's one graphic. On the left is a map of the world nations in various colors. Dark purple is upper income, dark green is lower income, and the light purple and light green are the middle income countries. So look on the left first, look at the right next, and someone tell me what pops out at you when you look at 1990 and 2024. So tell me what I'm looking at. Who might be happy about this period? Now, well, I'm sure some of you are dying to tell me. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I didn't see it. And I'm looking at Isabella. Isabella, what do you see? Here's the microphone.
I was just going to say that I noticed China and other Asian countries seem to have moved from the pink to the green category.
So there's an increase in the income, particularly in the Asian countries, starting with China and India, which I've already told you are the two biggest countries by population. So if those two countries move, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. Okay, so that's one thing you see. What else? Is it Julia?
While we do see like more change in like Latin America, South America, and Asia, there's not so much change in color in Africa.
So big difference. We've had Asia. Now we can talk about Latin America, and more countries seem to have moved up the ladder, so to speak. Don't see as much movement in Africa, and you're right about that. So not everybody is benefiting to the same degree. Asia, absolutely, we see that. Certainly parts of Latin America, and not so much in Africa. So the benefits are uneven again, but still look where they're weighted. They're weighted towards countries that in the past had been the third world of developing nations that only sold commodities. That world, I've already told you, is gone. And now we get to see some of the benefits of the transition, particularly for some parts of the emerging markets. Okay? So right away, globalization probably is a good thing for them. And when you do polls of people around the world about globalization, it's always the people in the poorer countries that like it, who think it's a positive thing. And I hope this map shows you why. Here's another interesting graph. Okay? First of all, it's called the elephant curve. Do you see why? Tail, head of the hump, then the nose goes down, and then it comes up at the end on the right. Okay, elephant curve. Done by two economists, Lackner and Milanovic, and it's quite interesting in what it tells us. On the horizontal axis, imagine we took all the world's population, which would be represented by you, and we put the poor people all the way down there. So you guys are sub-Saharan Africa sometimes, you might be Afghanistan, really poor countries. And up here are the richest people in the world, which is Olga and Katie. And they're rich oligarchs who own mansions in London and Manhattan and I don't know where else, okay? And you're all in between somewhere, okay? So we're lining you up from the poorest, richer, 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 the very poorest up there. On the vertical axis, we have the change in income per capita between, if I got it right in my head, I want to say 1990, 2008? 1988, well, that was good. 1988 and 2008, okay? So the change in each of those percentiles of distribution in terms of their income per capita, okay? And let's look at it together. And again, I'm going to ask you to help me out. Who is A? Who's all the way on the left? Just think about it for a second. Crystal?
People who have lower income are on A.
And where might they be?
They could be in Africa or like any other.
You're right, yeah. So definitely these are going to be sub-Saharan Africa, but also places like Afghanistan, parts of Southeast Asia like Cambodia, Laos, parts of Central America like Honduras. So, you know, that's who we're talking about. And clearly they don't benefit as much. But then let's start moving up from here up to there. Read what the graph tells me. And somebody tell me as we keep going, and we see that the increase in per capita income is going up fast, particularly as we move along to the middle of the thing. So who are we talking about here? Who are we talking about here? Who do you think? Isabel, who would be in the middle?
In the income,
Yeah, so here's our line. Those are the poor guys down there. Those are the oligarchs over there.
yeah,
I'm
it
in the
would
middle.
be
Who am I?
developing nations.
Such as,
such
maybe?
as some of the Latin American countries.
Absolutely. So Brazil, Argentina, who else?
Some countries in Asia as well.
In particular, China and
China.
India. So the world's middle class, not the US, the world's middle class is there, okay? And clearly they are benefiting. And again, I'm telling this to you over and over, it's China and India. That because those countries are growing so quickly and because they're so big, you have a big increase in terms of looking at the graph, in terms of the increase in GDP per capita. And then the line comes down. And it drops and it drops and drops. So now we're somewhere over here, okay? So who wants to tell me where we are now? Crystal.
I'm not sure, but I'm thinking, so we're at C.
Yeah, so we're talking about C, exactly right,
So
yeah.
like the smaller developing nations that are,
Well, but would they have benefited less, the developing nation?
or
But be careful. You're looking at the world, okay?
So, like-
So we've done the really poor guys. We've done those which are more emerging market, middle income,
like developed countries.
the
that
developed
already
countries.
had-
And in particular, the middle class in developed countries. Now, to us, with a worldwide view, they're doing pretty well. If you're middle class in the US, you have a nice income, but realize that's because you're in the US, okay? From the world's perspective, you're really well off, okay? You're not middle, you're in among the upper parts. But they don't seem to be benefiting as much. That's going to be interesting to think about. Last one. Who, besides Olga and Katie, who are the oligarchs who always do well? Come on, you can take a guess. Sydney? I mean, it's kind of obvious, like, who it is.
Is it people who have like heavily invested in oil and are therefore able to benefit?
They're rich people. And rich
the
people
rich
always do well, whether or not by investing in things like oil, in commodities that are maybe becoming more expensive, in stock markets, in bond markets, they always do well. That's why they're the rich people. And as you can see, they benefited tremendously from this change in the world economy. So first point, which I hope you can see, globalization is certainly good for some people. It's really good for some people, not so good for some other people, and super good from a narrow slice of people at the very top. That's going to have implications, isn't it, in terms of support for globalization. Got another interesting graph that Milanovic made. His name isn't on it, but it is his. Whoops. Oh, here we go. Just to flesh it out, in case you didn't believe what I was saying. There are the very poorest locked out of growth. There's the rising income in the emerging economies. There's the decline of the developed world middle class, which do pretty well from a world perspective. And there's the booming global elite. I should use those words. The booming global elite. And there's the elephant, in case you didn't see it. Maya.
What countries are in the developed world middle class?
So again, it's middle class from the world's point of view, which means that if you're a Chinese worker, you may not regard yourself as particularly well off, but you're a lot better off than the poorest countries. So you would be the world's middle class. So we have an emerging world middle class who are doing well, are spending money. And so now you see them spending more money on consumption goods that you and I take for granted. So you real change in like where Apple sells their telephones. It's not just in the US. And so they set up plants in China partly to make the phones more cheaply, but as I'm sure some of you know better than I, to sell in China the Apple phones. Although right now I don't think they're quite as popular. But that's what I mean. By now there's a new consumer class that's slowly emerging in many of these countries. Yeah, exactly. Okay? So there's the annotated version of the elephant graph. This graph shows the change in income inequality measured two ways. Make sure I got the colors right. Within country, the red line, okay, is measured by the ratio of the top 10% income, the top 10%, vis-a-vis the bottom 50%. Everybody got that? So take the incomes of those at the top of the ladder, the top 10%, over the bottom half, the bottom 50%. And clearly, as that number goes up, there's more of a gap between those at the top and those at the bottom. Okay? That's within country. So that's when I line you up within a country. So the poorest, for example, US person would be there, and the richest person would be there within country. Okay? And it seems that the graph is saying that if we go all the way back to 1820, okay, that pretty much within country inequality was high and then fell for a while in the 20th century, particularly after World War II. Do you all see that? That in the 1950s and 60s, we have a real decline of within country equality until the end, when it starts going up again. The blue line is between country. So when I line you up, you're not individuals. You represent a country. So again, the poorest countries are down there, the richer ones are up there, and we weighted by population. Because otherwise you're missing the impact, the importance of China and India as really big countries. So we weighted, and that's the blue line. Ha! Notice how low it starts out in the 19th century. A lot of inequality between Britain, France, and their colonies, for example. So it's a racial factor. It falls, okay? I'm sorry, it rises. I'm sorry, I said that wrongly. Between country inequality rises all during this first era of globalization I told you about. It's going up. All during the second era of globalization, it's going up, and peaks around 1980. And it starts coming down. So you have two phenomena in front of you. Within a country, inequality is getting worse, but between people and countries, inequality is going down. So the gap between the top and lowest countries is getting smaller, but within those countries, the gap between the richest and poorest people is getting bigger. Ha! Well, that has to have an impact. So right away, we're seeing a lot of interesting consequences of all this. So before I do the next part again, let me stop to see if there are any questions. I want to make sure you all see this phenomenon before we go any further.
Thank you. So in this first part of the graph, prior to decolonization, when we're talking about, within country inequality, did you say that that would include, say, Britain and all of its territories as one country, or does it count it?
That's the short answer is I'm not sure. I think, though, it would be separate. I think they would treat, particularly, I'm thinking out loud, so my answer may seem a little chaotic to you, but if I was doing the work, I certainly would not lump Britain and India together.
Right.
Wouldn't make any sense, right?
Sure.
So I think, now I feel more certain that the answer would be they have to be treated differently.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the advanced countries in themselves, and then you have their colonies, but they have to be done as themselves because they're so big.
Okay.
Good point.
Right.
Going all the way back. Oh, sorry. I'm just sorry. The data might be missing for like some of the colonies going back. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mako.
Hi, thank you. Kind of going back to the previous graph.
Yellow graph? Yeah.
Yes, you said like globalization was good for rich countries and not that good to the poor countries. But does it mean like globalization had a negative impact to the poor country, or like I just want to know like what the is there?
I'm not sure it'd be negative. I'm not sure Afghanistan was worse off.
Right.
At the end as opposed to where they were at the beginning. In a comparative sense, yes. But in absolute sense, there are always some benefits. There's going to be foreign aid that may be giving more than they did before, but that's kind of marginal. So I would say pretty much not that they're worse off, but they certainly have not gained, as we know, the countries in the middle gain. Yeah. Is it Rena? Yeah.
So then I guess instead of like the poorest, it would be definitely the middle class. The middle class. That's
the world's middle class.
Yes. Is that an example of stagflation? I forgot your definition. Okay.
No, there's real growth here.
Oh, okay.
Stagflation is when the economy itself is stagnant.
Okay.
As opposed to what clearly is going on here for the middle group, where their economy is booming because they're all a lot richer by 2008 than they were in 1988. That's what the graph is telling us for the middle. The China and India.
Oh, I meant the middle class.
Where?
Oh, I meant like.
Us.
Yeah, us. So we're doing worse than Afghanistan.
Middle class is ambiguous. Which word do you want? And you're right that this is telling us that the US, the UK middle class are not doing that well. That if anything, they're stagnant as well. Maybe not quite as bad as Afghanistan, but they're certainly not benefiting. You're right to pick up on that. We're going to come back to that point in about 5 minutes. And then Anya? And Anya, sorry.
You're good. So for the countries who are the very poorest, locked out of growth, what are the specific factors that contribute to that? Like, are there specific factors that contribute to that? I mean, I noticed that on your graph, a few of the countries that have experienced like the least positive effects of globalization are like conflict-affected countries in particular. I saw like Yemen, Afghanistan, like Somalia was on that graph as well. So these are countries that clearly have a lot of internal civil conflict.
Right.
Are there other factors that are contributing to that? Is there something that's making these impacts like less seen?
So those are really important questions, and development economists who know a lot more than I do about this would be better at answering it. But I'll give you what is my understanding. I think our colleague Olga would say in response to a question about that. You need to start with some basic infrastructure. You need to have something. You need to have some type of education. You need to have some type of stable government. So when you see countries that literally don't have roads and ports, that don't have a functioning government, that in particular, as you said, Somalia, have some type of strife, it's going to be hard for them to benefit. They're going to be hard to benefit. Sydney's going to get the microphone first, but while you're bringing it down, let me say also to Ananya that if you said to me, what's the one thing we could do to make some of the countries you talked about better off? The answer actually is very straightforward, and you may think I'm kidding, but I'm quite serious. Educate the women. That educated women will make very different choices in terms of size of families, in terms of health care for the children, in terms of how the budget, go down the list. Everything you could think of which would be better off is better off if you give women at least a secondary education. So that would be a really useful place. And of course, right away, I say Afghanistan, where they don't have a secondary, they don't have any education. So you can see, would it count in a place like that? Yeah, good question. Sydney, do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, just to add on to Ananya's point, I'm wondering what the role you think remittance economies may play into that.
So again, which economies?
Remittance economies, and the ways in which infrastructure may not be able to be built up in those states that are sending, I guess labor is the right term, and that they're not able to have those opportunities for growth, education, et cetera, in their own state.
So the literature on remittance is actually quite interesting. And I have a senior doing a thesis in economics about this topic, who knows more than I do, by the way. But I do tell you what I know. Remittance help out the family, particularly in terms of poverty. It lifts them up. I think I mentioned education in terms of health indicators. It seems to have a positive impact on democracy. I'm not quite sure how that works, but it seems to be in the data. Doesn't increase growth. Let me say that again. It does not increase economic growth. Because the government's not getting the money, they're not building the ports and bridges that you're saying they would need to do anything. And so it's very much split. So there are concerns about income inequality within the country getting the remittances. So these guys all have daughters or sons somewhere else, and they get a monthly check. These guys don't. Right away. You walk down the street, they have new TVs, they have things like that, and these people don't. So remittances are good, obviously, for the families, but they don't lead to the more macro consequences that I think you're asking me about. Yeah. Okay. So now that I see that I finally got your interest, we come, of course, on the next stage, which is what happens next. And the answer is the global financial crisis. So I don't expect you to remember it particularly well, but it did take place while you were alive. Financial crisis in the US, Europe, bringing down the entire economy, world economy. Slow recovery in the advanced economies. And FDI slows down. So not quite as booming as it was in the 1990s and pre-2008. Migration becomes a big issue. And migrants are blamed for taking away the jobs of native workers, for lowering the wages of native workers, okay? And trade is also linked to inequality within a country, and maybe now stagflation would become a problem in some of these countries. So that's when, you would then bring it in, okay? And we have the rise of the populist movements. Now, populist movements can be used in many different contexts. So let me give you a very nice definition of what they are that comes from Danny Roderick. Professor Roderick is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government. I use his book in my class on globalization. He has a lot of really interesting insights about these things. And here's his explanation, which I took from him, so it's not mine. A populist movement would work the following way. Imagine that you represent some population. And I come to you and I say, I know you are good people. I know you work hard. I know you take care of your families. I know you pay your taxes. All the things we expect good people to do, you guys do. But you're not enjoying all the benefits of your work. Why? Because there are not so good people, and they are taking away some of the benefits that belong to you, and you're suffering the consequences, which, by the way, might include inflation, the rise in prices over time. Elect me to be your leader, and I'll straighten things out. I know how to take care of all the problems that you're seeing, the inflation, whatever, and if you elect me, I will then fix things so that you, the good people, prosper, okay? You may be wondering, well, who are those bad people outside? Well, populism can take many different varieties. It might be the foreigners, and xenophobia is a very easy sentiment to play upon. So we don't like people who don't speak like us, who don't look like us. That would be one type of populism. But there are other types. Maybe I'm telling you this elite are the capitalists. They're the rich people, and they're screwing up the system, and we have to do something about that. So you will find both right-wing and left-wing populists. Exactly. That make sense? Ha! Well, that's good to know. So Bernie Sanders is a populist of a particular kind. Senator Sanders clearly blames corporations, and that's fine. But we also have people in this country who blame immigrants. That's right-wing. So that's what I mean by the different flavors that you'll see over time. Okay? So that seems to become more common. In the United States, 2016, two amazing events. President Trump is elected for the first time, and we have Brexit. Britain leaves the European Union. U.S.-China trade will now be disrupted by tariffs that President Trump puts on. Okay? And then, of course, and I know you remember this, the pandemic. And then everything shuts down, including global shipping. And we see how vulnerable the world economy is. And there's a real reconsideration of those global supply chains I mentioned before. The container ships going around the world, they're empty because no one's shipping anything anywhere. So all of a sudden, they seem to be not as useful as they were. Not much of an international response in common, although national governments do respond. And they began to say, well, we need to have some of these industries in our country. So you multinationals with your global supply chains, come back home. We want you producing the goods which now we know are important within our borders. So it can't be shut down by a global pandemic. And in the last year, as you well know, President Trump, being elected a second time, imposes new tariffs. The markets fall completely, and then he pauses, and the tariffs are not quite what we thought they were going to be. Other countries are using different responses. Japan's prime minister tried very nice to be good with President Trump, and not quite sure how well that works. The head of China has taken a much harder point of view, and they seem to be holding it pretty well in their own hands, okay? Other countries do other things. The Europeans want to keep the U.S. on board with supporting Ukraine, so they haven't really been responding to the tariffs. And now it's time for you to think about everything I've said for the last hour. Because I'm going to ask a question, and then you're going to think about it. What happened? And one answer may be that the benefits were widely spread, but the costs were concentrated on the middle class in the U.S. and Europe. And it was whoever asked that question, now we're coming back to it, okay? That indeed, here's where the middle class, depends on which middle class, and exactly the point I think you were getting to in U.S. and Europe. It's misleading to only count jobs lost. Technology also happens. Technology eliminates things, and I'm afraid we're all about to find out with AI, but I promise we won't get into that. They were seen as a real lack of response by the political elites. They were seen as threats to political identity, and that's going on today. And the term globalist is used to refer to elites who wish to remove national sovereignty, and it becomes a negative word, particularly in the United States. So, is globalization dead? No, national economies still operate, and certainly there are multinationals, but their expansion is going to be constrained by politics in ways that it wasn't before. It's a much more complicated game. As all this is happening, as I hope you know, there's big changes in demography. And the amount of new people being born is shrinking in Asia, the US, Europe, in lots of different places, which raises the question, who's going to supply the labor in the future? So maybe migration can't be shut off quite as easily as some people would like to think it could be, okay? That's fragmentation, okay? And it leads to an inefficient allocation of resources, going back to what I said about capital and labor being mirror images of each other. Will the world go back? Well, I don't know. Come back in 20 years and we'll know the answer to that question. It's not going to be easy to go back to the first, second, third world. Okay? Trade and finance are never going to be undone. We have much more than we did a generation ago. And third world countries like Brazil, Singapore, Brazil, Turkey are very good at playing the middle and try to have ties with both, obviously, the US, for example, and China on the other hand. So those are the blocks that I mentioned up above. Okay? How should we respond? Good, we have time to do this. I'm going to stop talking, and you're going to think about this. And I'm going to ask you, is this fair? What I just said to you last hour, is it fair? Is it a fair outcome? There are two different ways of answering the question, at least two that I know of. There may be third ones. The first is to have what's called a communitarian response. Communitarian means that you are responsible for the welfare of those around you, where around you could be pretty big, could be your entire country, but it's limited. Communitarian means community. So think about what I've just said to you, and how would you feel if you were a communitarian in India, the US, Japan? What do you think about all this? Okay? As opposed to a cosmopolitan point of view, which says, I care about the world. And that person's welfare halfway around the world is as important as this person who lives next door to me. That's cosmopolitan, okay? And as you can imagine, there are many, many philosophers who have written many books about these things, and I always find it interesting to kind of see the debates and see how they work, okay? So like I said, I'm not going to resolve this. I'm not going to answer it for you, okay? I want you to think about it. And Olga, what's the easiest way of organizing them to talk together? By rows? Is that okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you guys, could you just get together? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you guys. Could you guys join with those 3? And maybe the 2 in the back, so there'd be 3 groups over here. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's one group. Here's another, and would you join them? There's no right answer. Let me be very clear. There is no right answer I'm looking for. I'm really curious how you think about this, particularly you being an Albright Fellow. And you're here because you have an interest in global affairs. And you hear all this stuff about income going up, and a revision of the world economy and different groups doing better. Not everybody does better. And obviously it has political consequences. So why don't you take 5 to 8 minutes. All I'm going to ask is for one person to say, well, this is what we talked about. Again, there's no one right answer. I don't expect you to say, therefore we decided that X was the right one. Tell me what you think. Go. I'm very curious to hear what we've been talking about. Again, I don't expect you to solve all of this in 10 minutes, but be curious to hear some of the things you talked about. So can we start down here with this group of 3, was it? And somebody over here? One of you, tell me what you talked about.
So we became really realistic.
You became really what?
Realistic instead of optimistic in some ways. We kind of gravitated more towards communitarian instead of cosmopolitan.
You did?
Yes, okay. Yes. Our reasonings were a bit different, but overall we just saw that a lot of nations in both Europe and America, like the middle class or C, as we talked about, they have wealth disparities within their own countries, so it's kind of hard to argue that they should share that wealth towards other countries where they feel like they don't deserve it as much. Even in America, they don't want to give their taxes towards like the Midwest or the people that are in the middle and the most disadvantaged. So we say realistically, people will probably be more aligned with the communitarian beliefs, especially with politicians, is that's how they get elected, like the populists in both sides. But the only reason we find that people could change their beliefs in any ways is through education, in which you could like argue that it could be an economic benefit, like educating women to the country. But besides that, we we're quite negative and pessimistic as things go. But if you like frame it in a way that your opposition could agree with and see their own benefits, then there will be some change. But without that, there would be no change, and everything would be quite communitarian instead of cosmopolitan, is what we agreed on. Oh my God.
Very interesting. Would you mind passing it down? So what did this group talk about?
Yeah. So we talked about how the opinion you would have in this discussion is really dependent on your perspective, like what your position is. We talked about particularly politicians and kind of what you were speaking to before with populism, how it is easier for people to perhaps become elected if they're appealing to this, oh, we should care about ourselves, focus on ourselves, and think about our own country. We also talked about how it feels like particularly the US and other similar countries seem to constantly be involved in other countries in a broader political sense. And so to kind of say that, oh, we're only keeping to ourselves in this economic sense seems a little disingenuous when they're always, involving themselves other places.
Would you pass it behind? Someone from that group? Don't all volunteer them first.
Okay.
All right, Rhea.
So similar to what my other Rhea was saying, we were talking about how a lot of times cosmopolitan or communitarian language can be used, but the underlying actions maybe don't really fit in one or the other, fit more in one or the other. And we were also talking about how communitarianism might be easier to mobilize not just politicians, but also citizens, because they feel like they're helping people that are similar to them or have a shared sense of community, as opposed to cosmopolitanism can feel more abstract because they're, people farther than you or that you might not know.
Someone in the last row?
We kind of came to the conclusion that neither one is perfect. And we were thinking a lot about cosmopolitanism and how maybe when we first look at it, it might, you might think that it implies, countries giving aid to other countries, but it doesn't always, this opening up the markets don't always lead to the benefit of certain countries that have less power than the ones who already do. And then within those countries, cosmopolitanism might just favor the wealthiest ones, so then they become wealthier and the poorest people of those countries still become poorer. And there is I think within cosmopolitanism, there is a level of communitarianism in that the wealthiest people form their own group where they want to help out the other wealthiest people because they're engaging in the same markets and they don't want it to be disrupted by people who may critique the markets that they're a part of because they've never been included. So neither one is perfect. Anything else to add?
And do you have want to start down here?
Who wants it?
Oh, go for it. Oh. Okay. We were saying that the two approaches do not seem to be mutually exclusive, and there are ways that both could be implemented. We were specifically discussing the use of the word fair and communitarianism and trying to figure out if that means equitable or equal. With that, if that works within states, would that exacerbate the inequalities between states? And how can we pull on approaches between both to ensure that income inequality is decreasing, not only within the US, but between the US and say, another state in the area? But do you have any other? Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I think part of what we were also talking about is when we're thinking about the impact of globalization and sharing those impacts fairly, it's not just a question of economic growth, right? Part of the reason that globalization is so important is because, or I guess that part of the impact of globalization is that it's not just an exchange of capital, it's an exchange of ideas, of technologies, of access to healthcare and education and things like that. And so when we think about what it means to distribute that fairly and equitably, it's important to, obviously I guess maintain some kind of focus on trade and maintain those networks just to, I guess ensure that those impacts are being distributed. And when we think about things in terms of just our small, like countrywide communities, you're not really getting that exchange of those other benefits of globalization, and also the economic benefits of globalization are, still not going to be, I guess, felt if we have a more communitarian focus. I don't know. Do you want to expand on that? I don't know if I'm like accurately describing that, but yeah.
Well, you're past the microphone out back. I'm going to mention that we could also take the two-factor production, make a third one human capital. Human capital is the amount of education you have. And clearly, right, all right, that's going to change things as well. And so the more human capital, the more productive people are. So then the question is, how much do we want to allocate to that? So it gets complicated once you start breaking it down into these other parts. Anna?
Sure, yeah. So our group did, I think, a combination of both. We saw the pros and cons to both. And particularly, we discussed the narratives in which we heard a lot of these communitarianism versus cosmopolitanism. We talked about potentially the white savior narrative applying to cosmopolitanism, and also particularly other areas where there's sort of the white savior narrative applying in that case as well. And we also talked about the communitarianism. We've heard a lot of that in the US as well, in the sense that we have to deal with in-country inequality before looking at other countries. And so we discussed a lot of those narratives appearing. Do you want to add anything?
Last group.
Yeah. All right. Yes. I know I was the closest to the mic. I guess I'm going to summarize because I think a lot of groups have already talked about this. Like we mentioned, like what Rena had said about like how cosmopolitanism seems quite ideal, and like it's hard to imagine a world where every country is like equally contributing to every other country. Like even one person in our group had this like idea of like, okay, if the US gives money or aid to other countries, then maybe in the world of cosmopolitanism, other countries would give aid to the US, but then that doesn't really sit with us realistically in that way. But also we brought up the point of where a lot of countries that are lower income because of things like colonialism and globalization from Western countries. And there might be like a moral responsibility to not undo the effects of colonialism, but like because maybe the US and other Western countries have had that impact on those countries to sort of help increase everyone's income around the world.
Very good. Thank you, Maya. Well, you obviously covered a lot of territory. And again, we didn't solve anything. But going forward over the next 2.5 weeks, I hope you keep this framework in mind with some of the issues that you hear about. And certainly at the end, when you do migration, that obviously fits under this rubric as well. And so it gives you a sense of evaluating different judgments. And that's one of the things that the Albright Institute tries to do. Not force feed you something, but to give you ideas that you use in any way that you want. And I've been very happy over the years to see women who were in the Institute 10 years ago, 17 years ago, and see how far they've come and how much they remember of sitting in a room like this with 39 other really smart women. So I promise you, you'll have the same experience over the next couple of weeks, okay? Last thing before we finish, if there's any interest in anything I said that you'd like to follow up on, you're free to send me an email. I'm around this month. I'm in my office. I'd be delighted to come and talk to you. I'll have you come talk to me and ask questions. And I know I'm having lunch with some of you tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. And we can discuss things. Winnie Freund will be here later this month. Winnie is from the class of '59 and can tell you wonderful stories about Secretary Albright. And you'll really appreciate hearing her and her reminiscences, okay? So the last word is not me, but Mr. Gorenschatz, who's an economist who was at UC Berkeley, now at the IMF. And he said this in 2022, right after the invasion of Ukraine. The earthquake analogy is perhaps most apt because the war in Ukraine, reveals a sudden shift in underlying geopolitical tectonic plates. The danger is that these plates will drift further apart, fragmenting the global economy into distinct economic blocks with different ideologies, political systems, technology standards, cross-border payment and trade systems, and reserve currencies. The war has made manifest deeper divergent processes. We need to focus on and understand these if we want to prevent the ultimate unraveling of our global economic order. I'll leave you with that thought. Oops, hold on. And good luck over the next 2.5 weeks, guys.
Okay.